Charlie Chaplin stands in the cramped Keystone Studios dressing room, staring at the mismatched collection of clothing items scattered across the wooden table before him. Mack Sennett's wardrobe assistant, Jimmy, gestures enthusiastically toward the bizarre ensemble. "Charlie, trust me on this one. Wear this outfit. I know it looks strange, but something tells me these pieces belong together." What unfolds during the next 4 hours and 17 minutes of experimentation with this seemingly random assortment of ill-fitting clothes doesn't just create a costume. It gives birth to the most recognizable character in cinema history, proves that the greatest artistic breakthroughs often emerge from playful accidents rather than systematic planning, and demonstrates how sometimes the most profound discoveries happen when we embrace contradiction rather than seeking harmony. Keystone Studios Dressing Room 3, Hollywood, February 7, 1914, Saturday afternoon, 2:45. The modest backstage area reflects the chaotic energy of early film production. Costume pieces hanging from hooks on unpainted walls, makeup scattered across scarred wooden tables, and the persistent smell of greasepaint and photographic chemicals that defines the emerging movie industry. Charlie, at 25, has been working for Mack Sennett's comedy operation for exactly 1 month and 4 days, struggling to adapt his British music hall techniques to the faster, more physical demands of American slapstick cinema. His initial films with Keystone have been competent but unremarkable, earning polite approval from audiences but failing to establish any distinctive comedic identity. Sennett hired Charlie based on his reputation with Fred Karno's touring company, but so far the young performer hasn't demonstrated the unique screen presence that justifies the relatively high salary Keystone is paying him. "The problem," Sennett told Charlie during their meeting earlier that morning, "is that you're performing like you're still on a music hall stage. Film comedy requires something more intimate, more subtle, but also more visually striking. You need a character that reads immediately on camera, something audiences can recognize and connect with instantly." But what kind of character? Charlie had asked, genuinely puzzled about how to translate his theatrical experience into this new medium. "I don't know exactly, but I know it when I see it. Go to the wardrobe room, try on different combinations, experiment until something clicks. Sometimes the costume creates the character instead of the character determining the costume." This advice reflects Sennett's intuitive understanding of visual comedy, that in silent films, where dialogue cannot establish personality, clothing and physical appearance must instantly communicate character information to audiences. Jimmy, the wardrobe assistant, has been watching Charlie's films and developing his own theories about what might work for the young performer. Unlike other Keystone comedians who favor exaggerated, cartoonish costumes, Jimmy believes Charlie needs something more psychologically complex, an outfit that suggests depth and contradiction rather than simple comic recognition. "Look, Charlie," Jimmy explains while pulling various items from the costume collection. "Most comic characters wear costumes that match their personalities. Fat comedians wear obviously fat suits, villains wear obviously villainous outfits. But you've got something more interesting going on. You can play vulnerability and dignity at the same time." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could wear an outfit that makes you look important and ridiculous simultaneously. Dress like a gentleman who's fallen on hard times, someone who maintains his dignity despite obvious poverty." Jimmy begins assembling what will become the Little Tramp's iconic costume, but he's doing so based on aesthetic instinct rather than systematic character development. He selects each piece because it creates visual interest when combined with the others, not because he has a predetermined notion of who this character should be. "Try these pants," Jimmy suggests, holding up a pair of baggy trousers that clearly belong to someone much larger than Charlie. They're Ford Sterlings, but he's not using them today. Charlie puts on the oversized trousers, which immediately create a comical effect. The excess fabric bunches around his waist and ankles, making him appear smaller and more vulnerable while simultaneously suggesting someone who has recently lost weight or fallen from better circumstances. "Good," Jimmy says encouragingly. "Now try this jacket." The jacket belongs to Chester Conklin and fits so tightly across Charlie's chest that he can barely button it. The contrast between the loose pants and tight jacket creates an immediate visual contradiction, formal but ill-fitting, dignified but obviously secondhand. Interesting, Charlie murmurs, examining himself in the cracked dressing room mirror. The combination suggests someone who's trying to maintain respectability despite obvious practical limitations. Exactly. Now for accessories. Jimmy produces a small bowler hat that he found abandoned in a corner of the wardrobe room. The hat is too small for Charlie's head, perching precariously in a way that suggests it might fall off at any moment. But the bowler also represents a specific social class. It's the kind of hat worn by clerks, small businessmen, and aspiring gentlemen rather than manual laborers or wealthy aristocrats. The hat says he has pretensions to respectability, Charlie observes, adjusting it carefully. But the poor fit suggests those pretensions are somewhat pathetic. Now the shoes. Jimmy presents a pair of size 14 shoes that he discovered in the prop room, apparently left behind by some enormously tall actor. Charlie wears size 8, so the shoes are comically large, requiring him to shuffle carefully to keep them on his feet. "I can barely walk in these," Charlie laughs, taking a few experimental steps that immediately suggest the distinctive walk that will become the Tramp's signature movement. "But look at the effect," Jimmy points out excitedly. "The big shoes make you look like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes." There's something both funny and touching about that. Charlie is beginning to understand that each piece of this costume contributes to a complex emotional effect. The oversized shoes don't just look funny, they suggest vulnerability, displacement, and the gap between aspiration and reality. "One more thing," Jimmy says, producing a thin bamboo cane from the prop collection. "Try this." The walking stick immediately transforms Charlie's entire physical presence. With the cane in his hand, he naturally adopts a more upright posture, moving with dignity despite his ill-fitting clothes. The cane becomes both a practical support and a symbol of gentlemanly pretension. "Now try moving around," Jimmy suggests. "See how the costume affects your natural movement." Charlie begins walking across the small dressing room, immediately discovering that the oversized shoes require a particular shuffling gait that becomes unexpectedly graceful when combined with the cane's support. The tight jacket restricts his arm movements, forcing him to develop smaller, more precise gestures that appear both refined and constrained. "This is remarkable," Charlie says, becoming increasingly excited as he explores the costume's possibilities. "Each piece creates limitations that force me to move differently, and those limitations actually enhance the character's expressiveness." "What do you mean?" "Well, the big shoes prevent me from walking normally, so I have to develop an alternative gait that's more interesting to watch. The tight jacket restricts my gestures, so I have to find more creative ways to express emotion through movement. The costume is teaching me how this character should behave." This observation represents a crucial breakthrough in Charlie's understanding of screen comedy. Instead of imposing a predetermined character onto the costume, he's allowing the costume's practical constraints to suggest character traits and behavioral patterns. Jimmy watches with growing excitement as Charlie begins developing what will become the Tramp's distinctive mannerisms. The careful way he adjusts his hat, the dignified twirl of his cane, the patient shuffle that maintains forward progress despite obvious footwear challenges. "Charlie, you need to see this from the camera's perspective," Jimmy suggests, positioning himself across the room. "Walk toward me like you're approaching someone important." Charlie attempts a formal approach, but the costume's various constraints force him to create a walk that's simultaneously respectful and comical. He tips his hat politely, but its poor fit makes the gesture precarious. He steps forward confidently, but the oversized shoes require constant attention to avoid stumbling. "Perfect," Jimmy exclaims. "You look like someone who refuses to abandon his dignity despite obvious practical difficulties." There's something heroic about that. Charlie is beginning to understand that this costume creates a character who embodies contradiction, dignified but ridiculous, formal but impoverished, confident but vulnerable. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. Instead, they create complexity that makes the character both funny and sympathetic. Let me try some basic comedy gestures, Charlie suggests, beginning to experiment with how the costume affects traditional slapstick routines. When Charlie attempts to tip his hat, its poor fit makes the gesture uncertain. When he tries to sit down gracefully, the tight jacket restricts his movement while the loose pants create unexpected bunching. When he attempts to walk away with dignity, the oversized shoes threaten to trip him. But instead of these limitations creating problems, they generate new comedic possibilities that are more subtle and psychologically interesting than conventional physical comedy. This character could trip over his own feet and make it look like a deliberate dance move, Charlie realizes. He could have his hat blown off by the wind and retrieve it with such dignity that the audience forgets it was an accident. Exactly. The costume gives you endless opportunities to find grace in awkwardness, dignity in mishap. Jimmy's observation helps Charlie understand that this character represents a new approach to screen comedy. Instead of playing someone who is intentionally funny, he'll play someone who is unintentionally funny but who maintains his fundamental dignity regardless of circumstances. As the afternoon progresses, Charlie becomes increasingly absorbed in exploring the character's possibilities. He discovers that the costume suggests not just physical behavior but emotional attitudes and psychological traits. This person would never complain about his circumstances, Charlie tells Jimmy. He accepts whatever life gives him and tries to make the best of it with whatever resources he has available. Why do you think that? Because the costume itself represents making the best of limited resources. These clothes obviously don't fit properly, but he's wearing them with as much dignity as possible. That suggests someone who adapts to circumstances rather than fighting against them. This psychological insight proves crucial to the character's eventual appeal. The little tramp doesn't rail against injustice or demand better treatment. He simply tries to maintain his humanity and dignity regardless of external circumstances. Charlie also discovers that the costume suggests specific social relationships and situations. This character would be comfortable around both wealthy people and poor people, but he wouldn't quite belong with either group, Charlie observes. His clothes are too formal for manual laborers but too shabby for high society. That gives you dramatic flexibility, Jimmy notes. He could appear in any social situation and create comedy through the contrast between his aspirations and his reality. By 6:30 p.m., Charlie has developed a complete understanding of who this character is and how he should behave. The costume has essentially created itself through the process of experimentation, suggesting personality traits that Charlie never could have planned in advance. I need to test this character on camera, Charlie tells Jimmy. But first, I want to understand exactly why this costume works so well. Charlie analyzes each element of the outfit, recognizing that its effectiveness comes from the careful balance of contradictions. The baggy pants suggest someone who has lost weight or fallen from better circumstances, but they're paired with a tight jacket that suggests he's trying to maintain respectability despite those circumstances. And the accessories reinforce that theme, Jimmy adds. The small hat suggests pretension to gentility, but its poor fit reveals the pretension as somewhat pathetic. The cane suggests dignity and authority, but in the hands of someone wearing ill-fitting clothes, it becomes touching rather than impressive. The oversized shoes are the key element, Charlie concludes. They make everything else work by suggesting childlike vulnerability. This character is essentially a child trying to behave like an adult, using whatever resources he can find. This analysis helps Charlie understand that the little tramp's appeal comes from his fundamental humanity. He represents everyone who has ever tried to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances, everyone who has ever made the best of limited resources, everyone who has ever refused to abandon hope despite obvious challenges. 3 weeks later, when Charlie wears this costume in Kid Auto Races at Venice, audiences respond with immediate enthusiasm to the character's unique combination of comedy and pathos. The film's success proves that Jimmy's costume intuitions were correct. Visual contradiction creates psychological complexity that makes characters both funny and emotionally engaging. But the real significance of that February afternoon extends beyond its immediate practical results. The process of creating the Little Tramp costume demonstrates how great artistic breakthroughs often emerge from playful experimentation rather than systematic planning. "I learned something fundamental about creativity that day," Charlie explains in a 1952 interview. "Sometimes the best discoveries happen when you stop trying to solve problems intellectually and start playing with possibilities physically. The costume taught me who the character was rather than the reverse." What was the most important insight from that experience? That contradiction creates complexity, and complexity creates emotional engagement. The Little Tramp works because he embodies contradictions that reflect real human experience. We all feel dignified and ridiculous, confident and vulnerable, hopeful and disappointed, often simultaneously. The 4 hours and 17 minutes Charlie spent experimenting with Jimmy's costume suggestions proved that the most enduring artistic creations often emerge from happy accidents guided by intuitive understanding rather than careful planning, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries happen when artists allow their materials to teach them instead of trying to impose predetermined ideas onto those materials. The original costume pieces, Ford Sterling's baggy pants, Chester Conklin's tight jacket, the abandoned bowler hat, and the oversized shoes, are now preserved in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences archives, representing one of cinema's most important creative moments when simple wardrobe experimentation gave birth to an immortal character.